Okay, so we're recording now, and I do have sound. So let me go ahead and talk about what I've added to this. I'll go ahead and show you if I hit play here. I've got my usual stuff. I went back to my original collectible objects and door. I walk up to the door. It changes to red, and I get a hint telling me to go find something. I'm gonna pick up some, and I'll go back again, and it turns orange. So that's the scripts you're working on now. Get a different hint. I'm gonna pick up a couple more, and then I'm gonna notice that it says the light is green. I should check it. I'm gonna walk over. Inside, I have a box of flares. I'm gonna pick up the box of flares. So it's open the door, and I'm gonna throw it. And it lights my fire, and it tells me, congratulations, I got rescued, and it's going to start the game. Okay, so, and I could do the whole thing again. So that's the new stuff that I've added. I've added a win condition. For me is to pick up a flare and get out the door. Now I did that pretty easily that time. Sometimes I've set it up so that the flares will drop out of my hand after a few seconds. So I have to get out the door with the flare. And I've also put in here an area called can throw flare. And it's inside in front of my outpost. It's a big trigger. It's just an empty with a box collider set to trigger and scaled so that it's around this front part of my outpost, but pretty far from my fireplace. So if I run into that after I have a flare in my hand, I can actually throw the flare. Before that, I can't throw the flare. And if I walk out of that, I'll drop the flare. So if I try to run to the fire, campfire, I will drop the flare. I could make it harder by making that smaller, by making that trigger area smaller. I could make it harder by making the campfire further away. I could make it harder by making the timer shorter, so I have to do it faster. But I frequently dropped the flare and had to go back and get another one. And then I haven't actually implemented the I can only get like 3 or 4 flares, and then I'm going to starve to death because I'll never be able to light, or I'll freeze to death. So I'll lose the game. I think I would put that in next. And that's just going to be a condition to track how many times I've picked up a flare. So we know how to do that from our collectibles that we're doing. So those are the new things I've added, the dynamics of them, how they function in the game. Now let's look at the mechanics, which is the code inside of these scripts. So I've given you 4 example scripts, and let's take a look at each one of them so you have it on video, what they're doing, just so you understand them. So what they are is there's a flare pickup, a flare throw, and a flare trigger. And let's go ahead and look at flare pickup first. Okay, so the first script that I have here is a flare pickup script. This happens after I get into the outpost and I can go walk up to the box of flares. So obviously this one is going to go on the box of flares itself. Oh, sorry, no, this goes on the player. The box of flare, let's talk about flare trigger. Flare trigger is what's on the box of flares. And actually, let's go back to Unity and look at that box of flares. So I'm going to zoom in here inside. And this is my box of flares. It's a Megascan object that I went in, brought the texture map into Photoshop and wrote flares in where I had to look at the texture map on the surface and see where the front of it was. And it's in a weird place. It's in the upper left corner. But one thing that I did with these that I've noticed a couple of times, actually in the one that I did in Unreal and in this one, is that the texture maps on these Megascans are really dark. I had to lighten up this texture map a lot and put a little contrast in it to make it look normal inside of my game. So when I downloaded the Megascan mesh for it, I got the texture maps, just opened them up here and used my Photoshop tools to write flares. But I did a lot of color correction to make it look lighter. You're probably going to want to be aware of that. And then I added, in addition to, obviously when you get a Megascan object, you're going to get, you might get multiple nodes. Actually, this one, I don't have a empty parent. It's actually the mesh here as the top level. And then I added my own flares into it, which are just cylinders that I created and put a material on. So the main thing that's making this work is the box collider that I've added as a component, add physics box collider. And when you put that on, you got to make sure that you scale it correctly so that I'm going to be able to walk up to it and pick it up easily. And you're going to want to turn it on to trigger. I didn't even bother putting a regular collider on this or turn on a collider in the import settings because honestly, I'm never going to walk up to this and collide with it, except to pick it up. So you can just leave that off there, and that's going to be one less thing for Unity to keep track of, is another collision. So make sure you have trigger on, scale it however you want with the center and size settings, and then the script is going to go on this object. So here's my flare trigger script. You can see it has no inputs into this particular script. It's just going to run. And so if I go back and I want to look at that one first, flare trigger, there are no public variables, so there's no nothing coming up in the inspector for me to plug in anything. And the only variable that I have is a local variable, which I'm calling flare picked up, and it's a Boolean, which means it's either true or false. This is so when you have a global variable, which I do for my flares, you're going to sometimes pull that into other scripts because that's why it's global. So because you want to use it or reference it in multiple scripts. But sometimes you want to actually bring it into that other script and put it inside of a local variable before actually using it. And that's because you want to use it somewhere down here in a way, usually with an if statement of some kind. So a conditional. So if I have a Boolean flare picked up, I can set it to false to start off with, by putting the false into it under start. And then when we get down to our on trigger enter procedure, which you'll notice this is one of the procedures I use the most in this because triggers are so important in a game. I'm taking the global variable that's in another script called flare pickup, and dot flare in hand is the name of the global variable itself. And that's telling me whether the person has picked up the flare, whether the player has picked up the flare, and putting it into flare picked up. And then I'm using it in this if statement to say, if we collide with the player, if this box collides with the player, something tagged player, and the flare has not been picked up yet. So this is the thing that happens a lot when you're coding, is that you don't want things to run multiple times when you run into a trigger box, because you can stay as long as you want inside of a trigger box. And if you don't put something to keep that from happening, it'll just keep firing over and over and over again. You don't want that. You want to do some kind of if statement that will check, did you already do this? And if you only want to be able to do it once, then you got to put something in there to tell it, okay, don't do it again. We've already done this once. So in this case, if I walk up to that box and I get a flare in my hand, I don't want it to run again in the next game loop, that I should pick up a flare again. Especially if I stay touching that box. So what you do is you check, do you have the flare picked up? And a not symbol, a exclamation point in front of the variable name means not. So not flare picked up means flare picked up is equal to false. I could have written flare picked up is equal to false, but it's shorthand to put the exclamation in front and just say not flare picked up, because the variable, when it's inside of a conditional parentheses like this, will always be evaluated to true unless you tell it not to. It's the logics of it. It's kind of complicated. Like when I say not flare picked up, it's actually saying it's true that it's not picked up. Or it's true that it's false, is how it's evaluating it in the logics. So it's a shorthand for saying it's equal to false. And then if that's the case, then I should pick it up. So it's going to send a message to hold flare. That's a procedure inside of the thing that I collided with. So when you use these on trigger enters, the input to them is always what was the thing you collided with. And you can actually then look at what's on that other object. You can send a message to it to run a procedure on it. So that's what it's doing. It's running a hold flare procedure that is on that other object, and that script is on the flare pickup. script. So the flare pickup script down here has a hold flare procedure. And that's the actual one that makes it look like you have a flare in your hand. Okay, so the flare pickup procedure is on the player, and it's to sort of, well, there's two main procedures on it. There's a hold flare procedure and there's a drop flare procedure. And it makes sense that it's on the player because that's who's holding it. Your player's holding it or it's dropping it. And the other thing is Update has some things in it for automatically dropping the flare after a few seconds of holding it. So this procedure actually does have a lot of public variables and inputs at the top, and it does have a static Boolean variable, which is a global variable called flare in hand, and that's the one that that the other flare trigger was looking at right here. Flare pickup, flare in hand. So if I go back and look at my player controller, where this script is at the top level of the player controller. It's at the bottom where the inventory pickup script is. So I have two custom scripts on my player inventory pickup and flare pickup, and they both have things to plug in and set inside of the inspector. Hand flare is being plugged in with flare in hand, which is actually the prefab under my prefabs. Right here, flare in hand. And if I look at what that is, if I open it up, it's really just a flare that, or a cylinder that I've colored red. I've got a red material on it. And I've got some particles child to it, and which has both smoke and a flare particle that was built into the standard asset. So I didn't have to make that at all. It's just there's a bunch of particles in the standard assets that we brought in, and one of them is flare. And I also added a light to it as well. So it's going to illuminate when I have it in my hand anywhere I walk, right? I'm going to have that. And so I have positioned this in the hand of my character. So if I go back, my character always has a flare in its hand. So if I open up my FPS controller here inside of my scene, I will see child to the camera is flare in hand. It's there. And it's always gonna be there. I positioned it very carefully so that you can kind of see it with the camera. And whenever the camera looks around, it's going to be there with the sparks going and everything. And so it's like I have it in my hand. And it's always in my hand. And this is something that you guys should know, that when you do in computer graphics, whether it's in a game engine like this or whether it's in an animation, oftentimes you don't put things in a character's hand and just have them let go of them, because it's hard to do. It actually means you have to animate constraints to be on and off, because it's got to move with the hand when it's in the hand, but then when you put it down, it shouldn't move with the hand. So the easiest way to put something in a character's hand is to parent it. Whether it's a first-person character like this, where I have it parented under the camera, so it looks like it's in my hand, or whether it's actually on a skeleton like we did on the other one in Unreal Engine, where I had a third-person character and I used a socket to put it in my something in my character's hand. So in here, we're not using sockets. There's no bones or anything. I'm just parenting it. But to make it look like I drop it or throw it, all I do is hide the one in my hand. I turn off its visibility and I turn off the particles. And then it looks like it just disappears. So if I also spawn another one that has physics on it at the exact same time that I hide the one in my hand, it will look like I threw it, or it will look like I dropped it. Because the physics will kick in as soon as the flare is spawned, and it will drop. And it's not in my hand, so it's going to drop. So that's how I'm doing that in these scripts. I'm just hiding the flare in my hand that's always there. And this script is going to control that. So it's got some public variables. The flare in hand one I already talked about. That's just a Boolean. It's got a game object hand flare. Again, that's the object that's actually the physical object that's sitting in my hand. That's not actually the prefab. I didn't plug in the prefab there. I plugged in the one that's actually in my hand. So this one up here inside of the scene in the hierarchy that's child to my camera. So this is the one I dragged over to put into this public variable spot right here. Okay, so then flare to drop is another flare that has a rigid body. So the one on my hand does not have a rigid body on it. Rigid body is gravity and mass and all of that stuff. And it's when you want something to fall. I don't want the one in my hand to fall. So the one in my hand has no rigid body on it. It actually, I don't even think it has a collider. Let me just check, but I'm pretty sure I took the collider off of it. Yeah, it's got a mesh renderer. It's got audio and a material. It has no collider on it at all because I don't want it running into anything. But the one that I'm actually going to drop is a different prefab that I made from the first one. And it actually does have a capsule collider on it. It's got an audio source and it's got a rigid body on it. It has all the stuff that I would need to have it drop. And then I have another one that I'm going to throw. Why are they different? Because the one that I'm going to drop is going to be out. It has no flare at the top. All it has is some smoke. And the one that I'm throwing has the flare at the top. And it also is going to be tagged or named specially so that it will trigger the fire to start. They all have delete me script on them, just like we did the other things that we threw. So if I go back again out of my prefab and look at my FPS controller again, I've got one to drop that I'm plugging in, and that is actually a prefab because it's spawned. It's not in my scene anywhere. The ones that I throw and the ones that I drop cannot be in my scene anywhere. They shouldn't be because I'm producing them to throw them, just like we did when we shot the projectile. And then I've got a variable here for flare hold time. That's how long I'm going to hold it before I drop it. And I changed that for testing as opposed to playing. I want it to be more challenging, so I'll probably use a shorter time when I'm playing, but for testing, I put it longer because I wanted to make sure it was working. So if I go back to the script again, these are where these are all being put in, different game objects like the flare, or rigid body objects like the one that's going to be dropped. The one that I'm shooting or throwing is not in here because that's being done from a different script. Then I have a float variable for the timer, and a public float for how long I'm going to hold it. So the start only has flare in hand false, meaning that I don't have a flare when the game starts. And then the only time I'm going to get a flare is when this hold flare procedure runs, and it's running from the flare trigger over here. So it's running if I collide with the trigger for the flare box, it's running hold flare or sending a message for hold flare. And when hold flare gets run, all it's doing is setting flare in hand to true. So I won't get a second flare if I hit the box again. And it's activating the flare that's already in my hand. So set active true means it's turning it on so you can see it. Get component in children particle system play means it's finding the particle system that's child to the object that this script is on and then playing it. And then get component audio source is finding the audio source and playing the hissing sound of the flare that I have plugged in. So sometimes when you do audio, you insert it in the script and sometimes you don't. If I have only one thing that an audio source is going to play, I can just plug it into the audio source. So if I go back and look at the script in my, or the flare in my hand, it's got an audio source and it's got the sound that I want to play in there. So it's a road flare sound. And I've got it on loop. And I don't have it on play automatically, because then I would hear it as soon as I start playing the game. I only want it to start when it gets spawned. So the script is going to start that to play, but it's already there and plugged in. I don't have to plug it in the script itself. And that's what's happening here. And that's all that hold flare procedure is doing. It's just making it so you can see that I have a flare in my hand. And then up here in update, as soon as flare in hand becomes true, this if statement's going to become true. And when that happens, it's going to start the timer to drop the flare. And this timer works exactly like the door timer. In fact, I probably copied the code from the door timer and pasted it in here to make this timer. It's just something that's using the delta time of the game loop to pump numbers into this flare timer so they go up, plus or equals. And it says if that flare timer becomes greater than whatever I've set to flare hold time, then run the drop flare procedure and set the timer back to 0. You got to reset the timer because I'm going to be doing this multiple times, picking up multiple flares. And every time the timer has to be reset. The drop flare procedure is basically just spawning a flare and shooting it a very small amount. Actually, it's really not even shooting it. It's just spawning it. It's just instantiating it. So the way you spawn things in Unity is you instantiate them. You use the instantiate command. And you plug into that the thing that you want to spawn, so the prefab, where you want to spawn it, the position, and the rotation. And these are 3 inputs separated by commas. And so what you can see here is I'm using the flare drop prefab. That's my prefab in my prefabs folder for the burning flare. Or actually, sorry, for the not burning flare, because this is dropping. So it's going to spawn one that does not have the fire going on the top, just smoke. And then it's going to spawn it exactly where the other flare is positioned and rotated. So it happens in one frame, like the one disappears and this one appears. So you would never notice that I've switched them out, except that now my flare is not burning anymore and it's going to drop to the ground. And so it's going to fall because it has rigid body on it, and it's going to be named flare drop. Oh, sorry, here's the velocity. So it is being shot forward a little bit, but it's going to kind of fall right in front of you. And then I'm turning off right here the flare in my hand. So I'm spawning first and then hiding the flare in my hand with these 3 lines here. Set, active, false. And these are the same 3 lines I had up here to reveal the flare. I'm just doing the opposite. I'm using a stop on the particle systems, and I'm using a false on the active. And so it's actually spawning a second before, like a half a second before it disappears. And that's fine. It happens so fast, you wouldn't notice it. And then I'm setting flare in hand to false, because at that point I've dropped it. I'm going to go back and pick up another one. So I need to set it to false so that when I come up to the box again, the logic's going to be correct for me to pick up another one. I can only pick up one if the global variable is set to false. So that's how the pickup is happening. The throwing is just like our shooter script. It goes on a launcher object that I created on my FPS character. So when we did the shooter script, we just put it on the FPS first-person character, which is the camera. And you can see if I look down here, there's my shooter script. It's still there. So I didn't want to shoot from the middle of my body, because the shooter, when you put it on the FPS camera, it's shooting from the camera, which is kind of in the middle of my body and towards the top of my body. The problem with that is it's going to collide with the FPS controller collider. And that might prevent it from, it may or may not collide with the collider. Even if it doesn't, it's still not shooting from like my right hand. So if I want it to look like my right hand is throwing it, or if I want to angle it up so it kind of floats up and goes down, so I can actually throw it further, then I want to have an object to control that trajectory. And I'm doing that with an empty. So I call it flare launcher, and it's just an empty. Let's go ahead and go look at it here. It's just an empty that I've kind of moved out a little bit in front of my actual FPS controller. And so it's completely, it's out here, it's out in front of the collider, and it's angled upwards a little bit. You can see the Z is where the Z axis is the forward axis when you, in the code, when you're launching something, when you're launching a projectile. So I'm pointing the Z axis sort of upwards and a little bit left, so that it's going basically straight in front of me. And it's just better to have a launcher object if you're doing something like this. And that object is just child to the camera. But it's going to be what I put the script on. The flare throw script is on that. It also has an audio source that I added to it because the flare makes a sound, and I turn play on awake off. So when you plug stuff into this flare throw, you have the throw sound, you have the rigid body that you want to throw. In this case, it's a flare. And then you've got a throw speed. I don't want it to be too high if I'm throwing it, right? If I'm shooting a gun, that might be really high, but if I'm throwing something, I want it to be a lot lower. And then you've got this flare in hand plugged in as well, which is the flare that I actually have in my hand. So I need to do something to it whenever I throw. So whenever I throw, it's the same as me dropping it. If I throw something, I don't have a flare anymore. So I need to hide the one in my hand again. And so I got to have the name of that. I've got to have the object plugged in. So if we go look at those, these are a lot of public variables. There is a can throw variable. That's what I'm using to tell whether I can throw when I'm in that trigger area outside in the front of my outpost. I'll look at the can throws object in a second. So we have can throw global variable. We have a audio clip to plug in the sound, rigid body for the thing that I'm projecting, the speed that I'm going to project it at as a float, and whether I have the has flare as a local variable to contain the global variable that I'm also going to reference. Or sorry, yeah, the global variable I'm going to reference, and the flare in my hand is a game object. So those are coming up in the inspector, most of them, except this one has flare variable. I am using it to set that you don't have a flare at the beginning, and that you can and you can't throw, because I'm setting can throw to false. So this is really controlling when I can throw. I don't want to be able to throw a flare when the game first starts. I only want to throw a flare after I picked one up. So I have to has flare has to be true. And then I'm going to be in that area outside in front of my outpost within that collider, that trigger, so that I can actually throw there. And if I go look at that trigger, we've already looked at that script. That's what the flare trigger is controlling. Actually, no, we haven't looked at that script. Let me just go grab that object really quick. Here's the can throw object. It's got a can throw script. Now, I just realized that I forgot to give you that script, I think. So there's a fifth script I need to give you. It's just a empty with a box collider that I scaled to be in front of my cabin. And it's got this can throw script on it. Let me just go back and pull that script up. So I'll have to upload the can throw script for you guys too. So the can throw script, again, it's tracking has flare and can throw. And so there's a couple of local variables at the top of this. There's no global variables. It's going to reference global variables for both of those things. And it's doing it at the very beginning of an on trigger enter and an on trigger exit. So this is the only place in my scripts that I've used on trigger exit. So you can fire off something if you enter a trigger, and you can fire off something completely different when you exit that trigger. And that could make some very interesting dynamics. So what I'm doing here is when I enter the trigger, I can shoot flares. And when I exit the trigger, I'm gonna, if I haven't already thrown the flare, I'm gonna drop the flare. And so that's why that one's important. And so the on trigger enter we've used a bunch of times. I'm checking to see if I collide with the player and whether I have a flare. So if I run into this area outside in front of my outpost, and it's going to recognize I'm the player, and it's going to look for whether I have a flare or not. When I first walk up to the cabin, that's going to be false, and this is not going to fire at all. It's just going to stop. But if I've gone into the cabin and I've picked up a flare and I have it in my hand, it's going to know that from this flare in hand global variable that it's brought in right here. And it's going to be true. And it's going to set can throw to true. It's going to allow me to throw the flare. So it's really, this is not doing anything. This is just setting those global variables so that the other scripts will allow me to actually throw. All right, because those are looking at these global variables. There's a couple of things that I have in here that I put in for testing, and these are important to know. When you're, especially when you start to do your own scripts, putting in debug lines like this, debug.log, you have parentheses, and you put in some kind of string. And in this case, my string is can throw is ... And then I'm adding the can throw variable to it, which is actually going to look at that can throw variable and tell me whether it's true or false, and it's going to print that. So as I'm going through and doing my thing, I'm seeing whether I'm in the can throw trigger, and when I leave the can throw trigger, it comes up on the command line as can throw is true and can throw is false. And it's because of these debug lines that I have in both of these on trigger enter and on trigger exit procedures. So yeah, it's setting the local variable here to true, which means I'm in the trigger, and then it's setting the global variable to true from the local variable, this line right here. And you can see that I'm going through this and doing this sort of step by step like this with the debug lines, because I had a little trouble with this one. It wasn't quite working right at first. I wasn't sure it was working at all. And I had to sort of work it out and try it a few times and get it in the right order so that it would come up in the way that I wanted in the actual game. All right, the on trigger exit is doing pretty much the opposite. It's still checking the variables, and when you leave the trigger, it sets can throw to false. It prints that out as a debug line, and then it sets that to the global variable. The other scripts, the flare throw script especially, is looking for that. It's looking for that can throw to become true. So right here where this if statement is under update, it says if you press get button up fire 1 and has flare is true and can throw is true. So there's 3 things it's checking there. And all 3 things have to be true You have to have a flare, and you got to be in that trigger area to be able to actually spawn and throw or spawn and shoot the flare. And then the rest of it is pretty much just, it's hiding the flare in my hand because I'm about to throw it and it's going to get launched. And then launching the flare with an instantiate command. And it's using this is on the launcher object, so it's just using the transform of the launcher object because it's in the correct place for it to launch. And then it's giving a new name called flare, and that's really important because the fire is going to look for a collision with something named flare. And that's how you're going to light that fire. The velocity is going according to the throw speed forward, and it's playing a sound, and it's setting after it throws it. Has flare is false. You don't have the flare anymore. You just threw it. So it's setting the global variable to false. You no longer have a flare in your hand. You can go back now and pick up another flare if you want to. The last thing of these scripts is the campfire. If I select it, you'll see I put a big trigger on it, a circular trigger. It's a mesh object that I brought in from Megascans. I added a sphere collider to it, turned on trigger, scaled it to the size that I thought was good. I could make it smaller if I want to make it harder for my player to hit it. And then I have an audio source on it for a fire sound. And then child to this campfire, I have a fire complex. And it's got fire and smoke and flames and all kinds of things inside of it. This is another thing that's inside of the standard assets. You can just use it. And I plugged it in here, and it's hidden. It's turned off. So if you look beside the name fire complex at the top, the checkbox is not on. If I turn it on, you'll see the fire is there. If I turn it off, it's hidden. And so in the script, I'm really just turning that on by turning this checkbox on, making it active. So if we look at the script that's on this campfire object, it's called Windfire Trigger. It's got quite a few things to plug in, the fire complex being one of them. And then that's to turn it on. It's got a Wind GUI, the canvas, which I call Wind HUD. It's just the canvas though. The collectibles GUI, the hint text GUI, I've also got those coming in here because I wanted to make sure that they were hidden at the end here and they don't show up when I turn the canvas back on. And then a level to load is actually a string, and that's actually this scene. So you type in the name of your scene when you want to load a level again. And that's going to get plugged into the script. So if I go to my canvas here and look, I've made a canvas object, clicked on the plus symbol, did UI, and chose raw image. So I'm using a raw image. That's what you use when you want to put just an image that you make in Photoshop up on your screen as a GUI. And so I made this image in Photoshop. For my final windscreen. It's just congratulations. I put some text in there. I got a picture of a 3D model of a helicopter and stuck it in there, and I put it on sort of a dark background so that it would be more visible. It's transparent, so I'm saving it out as a PNG. And I tried to make it 2048, but somehow it came out to 2046 when I brought it into Unity. So I'm just scaling it down to 1024. It expects images to be either 1024, 2048, or 4096. You put something else in there, you're going to get a warning back. So I'm just scaling it, even though I was a couple pixels off for some reason. So transparency, saved it as a PNG, so it has an alpha channel, brought it into my Unity, and I put it in my materials folder. I didn't make a new folder for it. There it is right there. Now, one thing that you have to know, if you're going to make an image for your windscreen, you're not going to just use text. It's kind of nice to do that. I'd use them for other things, like, you know, if I die, I'll have some blood splatter or something maybe. So you need to turn those images to Editor GUI and Legacy GUI. If they're going to be part of your GUI, you don't want them as a normal texture map. You want to switch them to Editor GUI and Legacy GUI when you import them. Set the size to whatever you want, but you know, try to make them 1024 or 2048, something like that. And then you're going to plug them into a canvas that you make. And here's the canvas that I made that was for a raw image. And where you plug them in is where it says texture. And you go find your image and plug it in. And I set my size to 1024 because 2048 was way too big. I tried to purposely make it so that it would have a transparency around the edge, so that no matter how big my image size or my game size is on a particular monitor, this will not be, you know, too big. So I'm actually scaling it down a little bit. And it's set right in the middle of my GUI. So 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0 across the top, 1024 scaling, width and height. And that's it. It comes up pretty much perfectly in front of my camera view. Now that doesn't show up, it's turned off. You know, if I go over to game view and I turn it on, I can actually see what it looks like there. And I'll turn it back off because I'm turning it off here under raw image. And the way it's being run is from this Win script. So that GUI gets plugged into the Win script. I apparently don't have it open. Let me just open it. WinFire script. So right here where it says WinHUD. Actually, WinHUD is the canvas. The raw image type is the image GUI that I made. So each of these comments tells you what type of image this is. This one is the HUD, the canvas. Okay, so I'm plugging different things in, and then level to load is just taking a string, and that's the name of your current level if you want to restart exactly into the same level that you're at. If you wanted to go to a new level, you put the new level name there. If you want to go to a start screen, you'd put the name of your start menu. And we'll talk about that because I'll do that later. But the first thing that you see is the Win GUI enabled is equal to false, which means I'm turning it off and making sure you can't see it at the beginning of the game. and that my win condition is false. Now, this win condition, public static Boolean win condition, that's a global variable that I need to have in there to sort of make sure certain things didn't happen in the GUI. Like, I don't want my other GUIs to come up if we're going to win, if we're in the win condition. And so I actually had to go back to some of the previous scripts that I gave you, like my pickup manager, my door trigger script. Let's find that. I had to go back to my door trigger script and add in a check to see whether we were in the win condition, because otherwise this part of my my update section of my door trigger was showing my earlier HUDs for opening the door because they're in the update. And I don't ever delete them. I just hide them because deleting them could cause a problem. So I'm just hiding them. But when I reveal the canvas again at the end, because canvas is for everything, it was actually showing those because they're all the time updating. So by adding in this not win fire triggered dot win condition, that's looking at that global variable and saying, okay, only run this if we're not in the win condition. And that prevents that from happening, hides that GUI. It didn't need it earlier, but now that I'm at the win stage, I have to go back and add that in. So I created a global variable for that, and I'm setting it in here, and then we're going to turn it on. So the main thing in this script is an on trigger enter. It's for that collider that's set to a trigger that is going to look to see whether it collided, whether something collided with it that's named flare. And that's why we're naming our flares. This becomes true, and what it's going to do is take the fire complex that's in there and set that to true to turn it on, start the particle systems, start the fire audio, and start something called a coroutine called win game. And I'm also running a debug line. So this start coroutine win game, this is for a special type of procedure that I haven't used before in the previous scripts. A coroutine is a procedure that has a hold in it, a wait. So most procedures run through without stopping. A coroutine procedure will have lines that say yield, return, new, wait for seconds, and put the number of seconds to wait. And that means the script will run until that line, and then it'll wait a certain amount of seconds. Then it'll run the next part and wait a certain seconds if there's another one. I'm doing that here because if I restart the game immediately, code runs in less than a second. So it doesn't matter how long my script is. If you're standing there and you throw a flare and light my fire, and you have restart in your procedure, it's going to take you to a restart of the level immediately. And you won't even have time to see the fire go up. It'll start you before it even really turns on. So I'm waiting for 3 seconds so that I have time to look and see the fire starts. And then it starts the win condition. So it's going to actually play some kind of sound, a wind sound. I don't have anything interesting here. I just stuck a howl of a wolf in there. But you could play da 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 da, whatever you want to play to be your wind sound. You want to give it time to do that. So here I'm waiting 10 seconds for you to have a moment to savor your win, to look at your screen that comes up, the GUI screen, because I'm enabling it here. And I'm playing a sound, and then just making sure the other GUIs are hidden in these last two lines here. Then I'm waiting for 10 seconds while all that happens, and then I do the restart. To do the restart, I'm setting all of my global variables back to their original states. Because if I go back to the beginning of this, global variables persist into the next level. So if I don't reset them, they will already be sprung in the next level. I have to reset all my global variables. And then the last line that's taking me is a scene manager.load scene level to load. And it's plugging in whatever scene I typed in, and it's going to take me there. And then it's running a debug line. So those things will happen pretty much immediately, and it'll take me to the new level or to the same level, starting over again. All right, that's pretty much that entire script. You guys saw how it worked. I have to add the Canthro script to Moodle so you guys can have that as well. So definitely look at the video that I posted of the details of the previous scripts, because I went through them just like I went through this today. And then you can start in on doing something towards a win condition, whether you do exactly what I did here, or whether you probably do something slightly different, but you have a similar dynamics, so that if you go very far from what I did here, you're gonna have to change the scripts a lot. If you go a little bit away, if you're throwing something other than flares, or you grab something and you carry it out there to your fire, or you're doing something like you're grabbing a key and you're opening a gate, that's fine. But you're going to have to change your scripts a little bit to customize them for what you're doing. I'm going to want you to do that anyway, so you can go ahead and try that. But this is how these scripts are working. Any questions? I know most people are just working and going to look at this video later, so that's fine. I'm just going to go ahead and finish this up. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. And I'll stop recording as well.